Welcome to another exploration into the darker corners of American history. Stories that remain as mysterious as they are unsettling. Before we begin, take a moment to let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what time of day or night this narration has reached you. It's always intriguing to see how far these accounts travel and when they find their audience. With that said, let's journey back into the past. In 1859, as America stood on the precipice of its bloodiest conflict, these ancient hills witnessed something that defies explanation to this day. A company of soldiers marched into the wilderness and simply vanished without a trace. The story begins in the autumn of 1859, when political tensions ran as deep as the limestone caves that honeycomb the Ozark landscape. Missouri found itself caught in an impossible position, a border state where neighbor turned against neighbor, where loyalties shifted like morning mist through the hollows. The very air seemed charged with an electric sense of impending doom. But nothing could have prepared the people of Greene and Taney counties for what was about to unfold. Picture, if you will, the Missouri Ozarks as they existed over 160 years ago. This wasn't the tourist destination we know today, with its theme parks and lakeside resorts. This was raw, untamed wilderness. A labyrinth of limestone bluffs, dense forests, and hidden caves where a man could disappear forever. The Cherokee had walked these paths for centuries before being forced westward, leaving behind only whispered stories of sacred places and forbidden valleys. By 1859, the region had become a powder keg. The Kansas-Nebraska Act had ignited fierce debates about slavery's expansion, and Missouri, officially neutral but deeply divided, found itself torn between two worlds. In the bustling town of Springfield, heated arguments erupted out in taverns and general stores. Some residents flew Union flags from their porches, while others quietly harbored Confederate sympathies. It was into this volatile atmosphere that our story's protagonists would soon march to their mysterious fate. The political landscape was treacherous enough, but the physical terrain posed its own deadly challenges. The Ozark Mountains, despite their modest elevation, concealed dangers that had claimed countless lives over the decades. Sudden flash floods could turn peaceful creeks into raging torrents. Sinkholes opened without warning, swallowing everything above them. And then there were the caves. Thousands of them, many unexplored, stretching for miles beneath the surface like the dark veins of some sleeping giant. Local folklore spoke of entire hunting parties that had entered certain caves and never emerged. Native American legends warned of places where the earth itself was hungry, where the boundary between our world and something else grew thin. The early settlers had learned to respect these warnings, even if they didn't fully understand them. But in the autumn of 1859, respect for ancient warnings would prove fatally insufficient. As tensions escalated throughout Missouri, small militia groups began forming in counties across the state. These weren't official military units, not yet. They were collections of farmers, shopkeepers, and laborers who felt the need to organize for what seemed like inevitable conflict. Some supported the Union cause, others leaned Confederate, and many simply wanted to protect their families and communities from the chaos they saw coming. It was from this uncertain landscape that our vanished company emerged. Historical records from the period are frustratingly sparse, but what we do know paints a picture of ordinary men thrust into extraordinary circumstances. They were led by a local militia officer whose name has been lost to time, though some accounts suggest he was connected to the broader network of volunteers being organized by figures like Nathaniel Lyon, the fiery Union commander who would later die at the Battle of Wilson's Creek. These weren't professional soldiers. They were neighbors and friends, united by conviction and perhaps by fate. The company consisted of approximately 40 men, ranging in age from teenagers eager to prove themselves to grizzled veterans of the Mexican-American War. They came from farming communities scattered throughout Greene and Taney counties, places with names like Clever, Nixa, and Forsyth. Most had known each other their entire lives, had attended the same churches, helped with each other's harvests, and courted the same local girls. Their equipment was a patchwork collection typical of early militia units. Some carried modern Springfield rifles, while others made do with older muskets passed down from fathers and grandfathers. Their uniforms, if they could be called that, consisted mainly of civilian clothes with makeshift insignia. Blue kerchiefs served as identification, though the deeper they marched into the wilderness, the less such distinctions would matter. What united them was stronger than their equipment or their training. It was their shared belief that they were marching towards something important, something that would define not just their own futures, but the future of their entire region. The last reliable sightings of the company placed them near what locals called Devil's Den Hollow, a particularly forbidding section of the Ozarks where the limestone bluffs rose like ancient battlements and the forests grew so thick that noon felt like twilight. It was here, according to multiple witnesses, that the soldiers were seen making camp on a crisp October evening in 1859. A local farmer named Ezekiel Thompson later testified that he had watched the company from a distant ridge as they set up their tents in a clearing beside a spring-fed creek. He remembered seeing their campfire flickering against the bluff walls and hearing the faint sound of voices carried on the night wind. When dawn broke, Thompson expected to see smoke rising from their morning cooking fires. Instead, he saw nothing but empty wilderness, as if the earth itself had swallowed them whole. The initial assumption was that the company had simply broken camp early and continued their march. Military units, even informal militia groups, were constantly on the move during this period, and it wasn't unusual for them to depart before sunrise to avoid detection by potential enemies. Days passed before anyone thought to investigate their disappearance more thoroughly. When search parties finally organized, what they discovered defied easy explanation. The campsite showed clear signs of recent occupation. Fire rings, disturbed earth where tents had been pitched, even personal items that seemed too valuable to abandon willingly. But there were no tracks leading away from the site, no indication of which direction the company had taken when they departed. It was as if 40 men had simply evaporated into the Ozark morning mist. The first organized search was led by a local minister named Reverend Samuel Hartley, who had received reports from concerned family members when their sons and husbands failed to return home. Hartley assembled a group of 20 volunteers, including several experienced hunters and trappers who knew the Ozark terrain as well as anyone. What they found in Devil's Den Hollow would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The abandoned campsite bore signs of a hasty departure. Overturned cooking pots, scattered equipment, a half-finished lettee, a home that ended mid-sentence. But strangest of all were the tracks they discovered leading away from the camp. The footprints were clearly those of marching soldiers, but they led directly toward a limestone cliff face and simply stopped. Not stopped, as in the men had turned around or found another route. Stopped as in the tracks ended at the base of solid rock, as if the soldiers had walked directly into the stone itself. Word of the strange discovery spread quickly through the scattered communities of the Ozarks. Soon, additional search parties were combing the hills, looking for any trace of the missing men. Local officials, including the sheriff of Greene County, began organizing more systematic efforts. They brought in tracking dogs, experienced cave explorers, even a few Cherokee guides who still remembered the old paths through the wilderness. The dogs, normally reliable in following human scent, behaved strangely near the Devil's Den Hollow campsite. They would follow the trail to the cliff face, then begin whining and backing away, their hackles raised as if sensing some invisible threat. The Cherokee guides were even more disturbed, speaking in hushed tones about places that were not meant for walking, and holes in the world where things go in but don't come out. But the most unsettling discoveries were yet to come. 3 weeks after the initial disappearance, a hunter named Marcus Webb made a discovery that sent shockwaves through the region. Deep in a cave system known as Marvel Cave, a vast underground complex that stretched for miles beneath the Ozark Plateau, Webb found what appeared to be military equipment scattered throughout one of the deeper chambers. The items were unmistakably those that would have been carried by the missing soldiers. Rifle stocks, broken as if by tremendous force, brass buttons stamped with eagles, scraps of blue cloth that matched the kerchiefs worn by the company. But there were no bodies, no bones, no indication of what had happened to the men who had carried these items into the depths. Most disturbing of all was the pattern in which the equipment was arranged. Not scattered randomly, as if dropped in flight, but laid out in deliberate formations that seemed to follow some unknowable logic. As news of Webb's discovery spread, theories began to multiply like autumn leaves in an Ozark hollow. Some suggested that the soldiers had been ambushed by Confederate sympathizers and their bodies hidden in the deepest recesses of the cave system. Others proposed that they had encountered one of the notorious bushwhacker bands that were already beginning to terrorize the Missouri countryside. The bushwhacker theory gained credence when reports surfaced of increased activity by irregular forces in the region. Men like William Quantrill and Bloody Bill Anderson were already building reputations as ruthless guerrilla fighters who showed no mercy to their enemies. The idea that they might have eliminated an entire Union militia company and disposed of the bodies in the caves was certainly plausible. But plausible explanations couldn't account for all the strange details that continued to emerge. Local residents began reporting phenomena that defied rational explanation. Farmers working fields near Devil's Den Hollow claimed to hear the sound of marching feet on still nights, always moving from the direction of the abandoned campsite toward the limestone cliffs. Others reported seeing flickering lights deep in the forest, lights that moved in formation like lanterns carried by a company of soldiers. The most chilling accounts came from travelers who had occasion to pass through the area after dark. Multiple witnesses described seeing what appeared to be a full military formation marching through the trees, visible in their peripheral vision, but vanishing when looked at directly. The phantom. Soldiers appeared to be heading toward the cliff face where the tracks had ended, following the same impossible path night after night. Sarah McKinnon, a young woman whose brother had been among the missing soldiers, would later write in her diary, "I saw them clear as day, marching through the moonlight like they were still alive. But when I called out James's name, they faded like smoke, leaving only the sound of wind through empty branches." As winter approached, the searches became more desperate and more dangerous. Cave explorers pushed deeper into the underground labyrinths than anyone had gone before, following passages that seemed to lead toward the heart of the earth itself. Some of these brave souls returned with tales that stretched the bounds of credibility. Stories of chambers filled with an unnatural warmth, of passages that seemed to rearrange themselves when no one was looking, of echoes that carried sounds from impossible directions. One explorer, a German immigrant named Klaus Hoffmann, who had experience in the deep mines of his homeland, claimed to have found evidence of the missing soldiers in a chamber nearly a mile underground. He described finding personal effects, letters, photographs, even a watch that was still ticking despite having been underground for months. But when he returned with a larger expedition to document his discoveries, the chamber could not be found again. It was as if the cave itself had decided we were not meant to see what lay within. Hoffman would later write to his family in Prussia. The mystery deepened when reports began filtering in of similar disappearances from other parts of Missouri. A surveying party had vanished near the Current River. A group of Confederate recruiters had disappeared without a trace in the hills of Taney County. Each incident followed a similar pattern: men entering wilderness areas and simply ceasing to exist, leaving behind only scattered equipment and unanswered questions. Religious leaders throughout the region began to speak of divine judgment, of a land so stained by impending conflict that God himself had begun to reclaim those who would participate in the coming bloodshed. Others whispered of older powers, of Native American curses called down upon the white settlers who had stolen their lands and desecrated their sacred places. But perhaps the most unsettling theory was the simplest one: that the Ozark wilderness itself had somehow awakened and was hungry. As 1859 drew to a close, the missing soldiers had become more than just a local mystery. News of their disappearance had spread throughout Missouri and beyond, carried by newspapers and travelers who embellished the tale with each telling. The story took on a life of its own, growing in the telling until it encompassed not just the fate of 40 men, but the dark destiny that seemed to await the entire nation. The Springfield Advertiser ran a series of articles about the disappearance, each more sensational than the last. Headlines screamed of "Phantom Armies in the Ozarks" and "The Hollow That Swallows Men." While some readers dismissed these accounts as newspaper sensationalism, others recognized in them a reflection of their own growing fears about the chaos that was engulfing their world. The missing soldiers had become a symbol, not just of individual tragedy, but of a society coming apart at the seams, of a time when the very ground beneath one's feet could no longer be trusted. By the spring of 1860, as the nation moved inexorably towards civil war, the search for the missing company had largely been abandoned. Too many other crises demanded attention: raids along the Kansas border, political violence in St. Louis, the constant threat of guerrilla attacks on isolated communities. The 40 men who had marched into Devil's Den Hollow were gradually consigned to the realm of local legend, their fate a caution. Airy tale told around campfires and in general stores. But the story was far from over. If anything, the coming war would only add new layers of mystery to an already inexplicable disappearance. Because in the chaos of the Civil War, the line between the living and the dead would become increasingly difficult to distinguish. When the war finally erupted in earnest following the attack on Fort Sumter, Missouri found itself torn apart by conflicts that made the tensions of 1859 seem mild by comparison. The state officially remained in the Union, but Confederate forces under Sterling Price controlled much of the countryside, while Union troops held the major cities and transportation centers. It was in this atmosphere of constant warfare that reports of the phantom soldiers began to multiply. Union patrols moving through the Ozarks claimed to encounter a company of soldiers who would appear suddenly on woodland paths, exchange silent salutes, and then vanish into the forest. The mysterious figures wore uniforms that seemed both familiar and strange, recognizably military, but bearing insignia that no one could identify. Confederate forces reported similar encounters, but from their perspective, the phantom soldiers seemed hostile, appearing at crucial moments to confuse attacks or mislead units trying to navigate the treacherous Ozark terrain. Some rebel commanders became convinced that the Union had developed some new form of irregular warfare, using disguised units to spread confusion and fear behind Confederate lines. Neither side realized they might be encountering something that belonged to neither army, something that had been in the Ozarks far longer than any human conflict. The Battle of Wilson's Creek, fought on August 10, 1861, brought the war directly to the heart of Ozark country. Union forces under Nathaniel Lyon clashed with Confederate troops led by Sterling Price and Ben McCulloch in a bloody engagement that would claim over 2,500 casualties, including Lyon himself. The battle raged across the very landscape where the mysterious company had vanished less than 2 years earlier. In the aftermath of Wilson's Creek, as burial details worked to inter the dead, several disturbing incidents were reported. Soldiers claimed to see additional bodies on the battlefield, men in uniforms that didn't match either army, carrying weapons that seemed decades out of date. But when officers came to investigate these reports, nothing could be found except the usual tragic detritus of battle. More disturbing still were the accounts of soldiers who claimed to have been helped by mysterious comrades during the fighting, men who appeared at crucial moments to drag wounded fighters to safety or provide covering fire during retreats, only to disappear when the immediate danger had passed. One particularly detailed account came from Private Benjamin Morrison of the 1st Missouri Infantry, who was severely wounded during the battle. Morrison later swore that he had been rescued by a soldier he didn't recognize, a man whose uniform bore the blue kerchief that had been the identifying mark of the vanished company. The mysterious rescuer had carried Morrison to safety behind Union lines, speaking in hushed tones about finishing what we started and keeping faith with those who remember. When Morrison regained consciousness in a field hospital, he asked about his rescuer, describing the man in detail to anyone who would listen. His description matched perfectly with James McKinnon, Sarah's brother, who had been among the men who disappeared at Devil's Den Hollow. But James McKinnon had been missing for nearly 2 years, and according to the Army's records, he had never officially enlisted in any Union regiment. The boundaries between myth and reality, between the living and the dead, were becoming increasingly blurred in the blood-soaked hills of Missouri. As the war dragged on, the stories multiplied and evolved. Guerrilla fighters on both sides began to speak of encounters with soldiers who seemed to know the Ozark terrain better than any living man. Guides who could lead units through impossible passages, who knew of hidden caves and secret paths that didn't appear on any map. These mysterious figures were described as silent and grim, their faces bearing the marks of men who had seen too much death. Some bushwhackers claimed that the phantom soldiers would appear to warn them away from certain areas, particularly locations where ambushes were planned against civilian targets. The warnings were never verbal, just a sudden appearance at a crossroads or forest clearing, a sad shake of the head, and then a gradual fading into the morning mist. It was as if the missing company had become guardians of some kind, protecting the Ozark wilderness from the worst excesses of a war that had already claimed far too many lives. Bloody Bill Anderson, the notorious Confederate guerrilla whose band was responsible for some of the war's most brutal atrocities, was said to have encountered the phantom soldiers on multiple occasions. According to accounts from his surviving followers, Anderson became increasingly obsessed with the mysterious company, viewing their appearances as a personal challenge to his authority in the Ozarks. The confrontation, if it can be called that, came in the autumn of 1863. Anderson and his men were pursuing a Union supply train through the hills near Forsyth when they encountered what appeared to be a full company of Federal soldiers blocking their path. The mysterious soldiers made no aggressive moves, but neither did they retreat when Anderson's men approached. Instead, they simply stood in formation, weapons at the ready, watching the bushwhackers with eyes that seemed to hold depths of sorrow and determination. Anderson ordered his men to charge, but as they spurred their horses forward, the phantom soldiers began to fade, becoming translucent and then disappearing entirely. The bushwhackers found themselves charging through empty air, their horses rearing and refusing to continue forward despite their riders' commands. According to witnesses, Anderson himself turned pale as winter snow, staring at the empty space where the soldiers had stood. He ordered his men to retreat immediately, abandoning their pursuit of the supply train. He never spoke publicly of what he had seen, but those close to him noticed a change, a haunted quality that hadn't been there before. William Quantrill, Anderson's sometimes rival and sometimes ally, had his own encounters with the unexplained. During his infamous raid on Lawrence, Kansas, in August 1863, several of his men reported seeing soldiers in unfamiliar uniforms watching from distant hillsides as the bushwhackers prepared their attack. The watchers made no move to interfere, but their presence was deeply unsettling to men who prided themselves on their fierce reputation. After the Lawrence massacre, as Quantrill's raiders made their way back into Missouri, they were repeatedly harassed by what appeared to be a small Union patrol. The mysterious soldiers would appear suddenly on ridgelines, fire a few shots, and then vanish before the bushwhackers could respond. The attacks weren't designed to inflict casualties. They seemed intended to delay and confuse, to make the raiders' journey home as difficult as possible. Years later, one of Quantrill's surviving men would write, "It was like the very hills had turned against us, like the land itself was trying to make us pay for what we'd done." As 1864 arrived, bringing with it some of the war's bloodiest campaigns, the phantom soldiers seemed to become more active. Union and Confederate forces alike reported encounters that defied military logic. Sentries would challenge approaching figures, only to have their calls answered by men who spoke with the accents of Missouri farmers, but who couldn't be seen clearly in the darkness. Supply convoys traveling through the Ozarks began to report mysterious escorts, companies of soldiers who would appear at dangerous passages and provide protection until the convoy reached safety, then disappear without accepting thanks or recognition. These escorts never asked for identification or passwords, seeming to know instinctively which side they were helping. Most remarkably, both Union and Confederate forces reported receiving this mysterious assistance, as if the phantom soldiers recognized no earthly authority beyond their own sense of duty. The encounters weren't limited to military personnel. Civilians fleeing the violence that had engulfed Missouri spoke of being guided to safety by soldiers who seemed to materialize from the morning mist. Families separated by the chaos of war told of receiving messages from loved ones delivered by men in military dress who would appear at farmhouse doors, deliver their communications, and then fade into the gathering dusk. Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, one of the few female physicians in Missouri during the war period, kept detailed records of her experiences traveling between communities to provide medical care. Her journals, discovered decades later in the attic of her Springfield home, contain numerous references to encounters with the company that time forgot. "They appear when needed most," she wrote in an entry dated September 1864, "silent guardians who ask nothing but seem to give everything. I have seen them guide lost children, dren home, help bury the dead when no one else would claim them, and stand watch over the wounded when human help was not available. They are more real than many of the living, and more honorable than most." As the war began to wind down in early 1865, the phantom soldiers seemed to grow more visible, as if the approaching peace was allowing them to manifest more clearly in the physical world. Photographers documenting the aftermath of battles occasionally found unexplained figures in their images. Soldiers standing in formation at the edges of battlefields, their faces obscured by shadows that seemed too deep for the available light. One particularly striking photograph, taken by Alexander Gardner during his documentation of Civil War sites, shows the aftermath of a skirmish near Branson. In the background, almost hidden among the trees, stands what appears to be a full company of soldiers in perfect formation. The figures are translucent, visible, but clearly not entirely present in the physical world. Gardner himself noted on the back of the photograph, "Unknown company observed during exposure. Figures appeared solid to naked eye, but registered as transparent on plate. Most remarkable phenomenon I have encountered in years of war photography. The end of the Civil War in April 1865 might have been expected to bring closure to the mystery of the vanished soldiers. Instead, it seemed to mark the beginning of a new chapter in their strange story. As Union and Confederate veterans began the long process of returning home and rebuilding their lives, many brought with them tales of encounters that couldn't be easily explained or forgotten. Veterans' gatherings throughout Missouri often featured discussions of the Phantom Company. Men who had served on opposite sides found common ground in their shared experiences of encountering the mysterious soldiers. These weren't ghost stories told around campfires for entertainment. They were sober testimonies from men who had seen the worst that war could offer and who knew the difference between reality and hallucination. The consensus that emerged from these gatherings was both remarkable and unsettling. The vanished company was still out there, still serving in some capacity that transcended the earthly conflicts that had torn the nation apart. Samuel Carter, a Union veteran who had served with the 8th Missouri Infantry, became something of an unofficial historian of the phantom soldier encounters. In letters to his family, preserved in the Missouri State Archives, Carter documented dozens of reported sightings and encounters. His careful research revealed patterns that suggested the mysterious company operated according to its own sense of duty and honor. They seemed drawn to places where injustice has occurred, Carter wrote in 1867, appearing to comfort the afflicted and confound those who would prey upon the innocent. I have spoken with farmers whose crops were mysteriously harvested when illness prevented them from working their fields, and with widows who found their fences mended and their wells cleaned by unknown hands. If these are indeed our missing brothers from the Devil's Den Hollow, then death has not released them from their oath to protect and serve. It has only expanded the scope of their duty beyond the boundaries of any earthly army. As the Reconstruction era brought new challenges to Missouri, reports of the phantom soldiers began to take on different characteristics. They were seen escorting former slaves to safety during the dangerous journey north, standing guard over schools being established for newly freed African Americans, and protecting Republican officials from Ku Klux Klan violence. The mysterious company seemed to have evolved beyond their original identity as Union militia. They had become something more universal, guardians of justice and protectors of the innocent, regardless of race or political affiliation. Their appearances were reported throughout the Ozarks, but always in connection with acts of service or protection. In a time when the nation was struggling to heal from 4 years of brutal warfare, the phantom soldiers represented something that many found deeply comforting. The idea that some bonds of duty and honor could survive even death itself. Railroad workers building the Missouri Pacific Line through the Ozarks in the 1870s reported numerous encounters with the mysterious company. Construction crews working in remote areas would sometimes find their camps guarded by silent sentries who would disappear at dawn. Tools left behind accidentally would be found neatly arranged at work sites the next morning, sometimes accompanied by warnings about unstable ground or dangerous weather conditions. The most dramatic incident occurred during the construction of a bridge over the White River. Workers had been struggling with a particularly difficult section when a landslide threatened to bury several men alive. Survivors later testified that a company of soldiers had appeared seemingly from nowhere, working alongside the living to rescue those trapped by the falling earth. They worked with a desperate intensity, one survivor recalled, like men who knew what it meant to lose comrades and would not allow it to happen again. When the last man was pulled free, they simply stepped back into the forest and were gone. The transition from the 19th to the 20th century brought new technologies and new ways of thinking to the Ozarks, but it didn't diminish the reports of phantom soldier encounters. If anything, the contrast between modern rationalism and ancient mystery made the sightings seem more remarkable rather than less. Automobile travelers in the early 1900s reported seeing formations of soldiers marching along remote roads, their uniforms and equipment clearly from an earlier era. The Phantom Company seemed to have adapted to the changing times, appearing now to help motorists with broken-down vehicles or to guide lost travelers back to main roads. Dr. Margaret Hayes, a professor of history at what would later become Missouri State University, began collecting and documenting these accounts in the 1920s. Her research, published as The Eternal Company, A Study in Ozark Folklore, remains one of the most comprehensive examinations of the phenomenon. What emerges from these accounts, Dr. Hayes wrote, is not simply a ghost story, but something far more complex, a collective unconscious expression of the region's traumatic memories, given form and substance by the power of shared belief. Whether one accepts these soldiers as literal supernatural entities or as psychological phenomena, their impact on the communities of the Ozarks has been profound and lasting. Hayes interviewed dozens of witnesses over the course of her research, including elderly Civil War veterans who claimed to have served alongside the Phantom soldiers during the war. She found remarkable consistency in their descriptions, even among witnesses who had never met each other or shared their stories. The soldiers were always described as solemn, but not frightening, purposeful in their actions, and utterly devoted to helping those in need. They spoke rarely, and when they did, it was in the dialect of 19th-century Missouri farmers. They bore no insignia of rank beyond the blue kerchiefs that had identified the original vanished company. During the Great Depression of the 1930s, when the Ozarks region was particularly hard hit by economic hardship, reports of Phantom soldier assistance reached new heights. Familles, lies who had lost their farms, told of finding anonymous gifts of food and supplies on their doorsteps, delivered by men in military dress who would disappear when approached. Work crews building roads and bridges as part of New Deal programs reported being joined by additional workers who would appear during the most difficult phases of construction, laboring tirelessly without pay or recognition. Supervisors learned not to question these mysterious helpers, understanding instinctively that some forms of assistance transcended normal bureaucratic procedures. They seemed to understand that honest work was its own form of service, wrote Thomas McKinney, a foreman on a civilian conservation corps project. They'd show up when the job got dangerous, or when we were falling behind schedule, work harder than any man had a right to, and then slip away when their help was no longer needed. World War II brought a new dimension to the Phantom soldier legend. Young men from the Ozarks, heading off to fight in Europe and the Pacific, reported receiving visits from members of the mysterious company, who would appear to offer encouragement and advice to soldiers about to face combat for the first time. These encounters were described as deeply moving experiences. The Phantom soldiers, who had witnessed the birth of modern warfare during the Civil War, seemed to understand the fears and doubts of their younger counterparts. They spoke of honor, duty, and the importance of looking after one's comrades, but they also offered comfort to those who were afraid. He told me that fear was natural, that any man who wasn't afraid going into battle was either lying or crazy, recalled Staff Sergeant James Morrison, grandson of the Benjamin Morrison who had been rescued at Wilson's Creek. But he said that doing your duty, despite the fear, that was what separated soldiers from mere fight. The post-war era saw continued reports of Phantom soldier encounters, but with new variations that reflected the changing nature of the Ozarks region. As tourism began to develop around the area's natural beauty, lost hikers and campers reported being guided to safety by men in military dress who seemed to know every trail and landmark in the wilderness. The soldiers appeared to have particular concern for children and young people. Summer camp counselors told of mysterious figures who would watch over children during overnight camping trips, and parents reported that their children would sometimes speak of the soldier men who had helped them when they became lost in the woods. These accounts were particularly poignant because they suggested that the phantom soldiers understood their role as protectors of future generations, guardians not just of the present, but of the promise that the future held. Archaeological excavations in the Devil's Den Hollow area during the 1960s uncovered evidence that seemed to support at least some aspects of the phantom soldier legend. Researchers found remnants of a military camp from the correct time period, including buttons, buckles, and weapon fragments that matched contemporary descriptions of the vanished company's equipment. More intriguingly, the excavations revealed evidence of unusual geological activity in the area. The limestone bedrock showed signs of significant shifting and settling that had occurred sometime in the mid-19th century, possibly triggered by underground water movement or seismic activity. Some researchers theorized that the missing soldiers might have been victims of a sudden sinkhole collapse that had later been filled in by natural processes. But even this seemingly rational explanation couldn't account for the continued sightings and encounters that persisted well into the modern era. If the soldiers had died in a geological accident over a century ago, what was it that people continued to see in the Ozark wilderness? The 1970s and 1980s brought new attention to the phantom soldier phenomenon as paranormal investigators and journalists began documenting encounters with more sophisticated equipment. Tape recordings captured unexplained sounds of marching feet and muffled commands in areas where the soldiers had been sighted. Photographs occasionally showed unexplained figures in military dress, though these images were often dismissed as hoaxes or natural phenomena. Television documentaries and magazine articles spread the story beyond the Ozarks, attracting tourists and thrill-seekers who hoped to encounter the mysterious company for themselves. Most left disappointed, but a significant number reported genuine encounters that left them profoundly affected. What seemed clear from these investigations was that the phantom soldiers were not mere figments of imagination or products of local folklore. Something real was happening in the Ozark wilderness, something that defied easy categorization or explanation. Dr. James Patterson, a psychologist from the University of Missouri, spent several years in the 1990s studying the phantom soldier phenomenon from a scientific perspective. His research, published in the Journal of Anomalous Phenomena, suggested that the encounters might represent a form of collective consciousness, a shared psychological response to traumatic historical events that had somehow achieved independent existence. What we're dealing with here, Patterson wrote, may be less a supernatural phenomenon than a psychological one that has become so deeply embedded in the regional consciousness that it has achieved a form of objective reality. The soldiers exist because the community needs them to exist, as symbols of duty, honor, and sacrifice that transcend the boundaries of life and death. But even Patterson acknowledged that his theories couldn't fully explain the consistency and detail of the encounters, or the fact that the phantom soldiers seemed capable of physically interacting with the environment in ways that suggested genuine presence rather than mere hallucination. As the 21st century dawned, bringing with it new technologies and new ways of understanding the world, the phantom soldiers of the Missouri Ozarks continued to make their presence known. Cell phone cameras occasionally captured unexplained figures in military dress, though these images were often too blurry or indistinct to serve as definitive proof. GPS devices sometimes malfunctioned in areas where the soldiers had been sighted, leading lost travelers along routes that didn't appear on any map, but that invariably led to safety. Emergency responders reported receiving assistance from unidentified personnel during rescue operations in remote areas, only to find no record of additional units being dispatched to the scene. The phantom soldiers had adapted to the modern world while maintaining their essential character as protectors and servants of the greater good. They remained, as they had always been, a mystery that transcended simple explanation. In the aftermath of the September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks, when the nation was struggling to understand its vulnerability and redefine its sense of security, reports of phantom soldier encounters in the Ozarks took on new significance. The mysterious company seemed to represent something that many Americans found deeply reassuring: the idea that the nation's protectors never truly abandoned their posts, that duty and honor could survive even the ultimate sacrifice. Veterans returning from Afghanistan and Iraq reported encounters with the phantom soldiers that echoed the experiences of earlier generations. The mysterious Company S aimed to understand the unique challenges faced by modern warriors, offering comfort and guidance to those struggling with the invisible wounds of contemporary warfare. They knew things, recalled Marine Sergeant Lisa Chen, who encountered the phantom soldiers while visiting the Ozarks on leave in 2005. They understood what it was like to serve in a war that people back home couldn't quite comprehend, to carry responsibilities that felt too heavy for any one person to bear. Just knowing they were still out there, still serving in their own way, made my own service feel part of something larger. Today, more than 160 years after that autumn day in 1859, when 40 men marched into Devil's Den Hollow and vanished from history, the mystery endures. The phantom soldiers continue to be sighted throughout the Missouri Ozarks, still dressed in their Civil War-era uniforms, still bearing the blue kerchiefs that had identified them as members of that long-lost company. They appear to hikers lost in the wilderness, guiding them to safety with silent gestures and patient dedication. They stand guard over children at summer camps, their presence felt rather than seen by counselors who wake in the night with an inexplicable sense of security. They assist emergency responders during natural disasters, working alongside the living to rescue those in danger, and then fading away before they can be properly thanked. The soldiers ask for no recognition, accept no reward, and leave no trace beyond the lives they touch and the mysterious comfort they provide to those who encounter them. Modern paranormal investigators continue to study the phenomenon, using sophisticated equipment to document electromagnetic anomalies, temperature fluctuations, and audio recordings that might provide scientific evidence for the soldiers' existence. But perhaps the most compelling evidence remains the simplest: the testimony of ordinary people whose lives have been touched by encounters that defy rational explanation, but that feel more real than most of their everyday experiences. Dr. Sarah McKinnon Hayes, a descendant of both the vanished James McKinnon and the historian Dr. Margaret Hayes, has spent her career studying the phantom soldier phenomenon. Her work combines historical research with modern investigative techniques, seeking to understand not just what happened to the original company, but why their story continues to resonate so powerfully more than a century and a half later. The question isn't whether these soldiers really exist, Dr. McKinnon Hayes argues in her recent book, The Eternal Guard: Mystery and Meaning in the Missouri Ozarks. The question is what their continued presence tells us about ourselves, about our need for heroes who serve without reward, who protect without recognition, who embody the best qualities of the human spirit, even in death. Perhaps that's the real lesson of the phantom soldiers of Devil's Den Hollow. In a world that often seems short on genuine heroes, where duty and honor can seem like quaint anachronisms, the story of the vanished company offers something precious, a reminder that some forms of service transcend the boundaries of life and death, that true dedication never really ends, and that somewhere in the misty hollows of the Missouri Ozarks, 40 men continue to keep faith with an oath they took more than 160 years ago. The hills remember, the caves keep their secrets, and somewhere in the shadows, between then and now, between the living and the dead, the eternal company marches on. Whether you believe in ghosts or dismiss such stories as folklore, whether you see the phantom soldiers as supernatural entities or as symbols of collective memory, our impact on the Ozarks region has been undeniable. They have become part of the landscape itself, as much a feature of the area as the limestone bluffs and hidden caves that gave birth to their mystery. For the families of the original vanished soldiers, the continued sightings offer a form of comfort that transcends understanding. James McKinnon may have disappeared from the mortal world in 1859, but according to the accounts that continue to pour in, his service never ended. He and his comrades found a way to keep their promise to protect and serve, even when conventional military duty was no longer possible. And perhaps, in the end, that's enough. Perhaps the greatest mysteries are not meant to be solved, but simply to be honored and remembered. The story of the phantom soldiers reminds us that some things matter more than life itself. Duty, honor, the willingness to sacrifice for others. In an age when such values can seem endangered, when cynicism and self-interest often prevail over service and sacrifice, the vanished company of Devil's Den Hollow stands as an eternal reminder of what we can be at our best. They marched into the wilderness in 1859, 40 men answering the call of duty in a time of national crisis. They never returned home, never received the recognition they deserved for their service, never got to see the country they died to preserve, reunited and healed. But according to the countless witnesses who have encountered them over the decades, they never stopped serving. They never abandoned their post. They simply expanded their definition of duty to encompass not just their original mission, but the eternal obligation to protect the innocent and serve the greater good. In the end, the mystery of the phantom soldiers may be less about what happened to 40 men in a Missouri hollow more than 160 years ago, and more about what continues to happen in the hearts and minds of those who encounter their story. They represent something that many of us long for, the assurance that dedication and sacrifice matter, that service can transcend death itself, and that somewhere, always, guardians are watching over us. The Devil's Den Hollow has kept its secret for more than a century and a half. But perhaps that secret was never meant to be solved, only experienced, honored, and passed down from one generation to the next as a reminder of the best that humanity has to offer. As long as there are Ozark hills to walk and caves to explore, as long as there are people who need protection and causes worth serving, the phantom soldiers will likely continue their eternal patrol. They are part of the landscape now, woven into the very fabric of the region's identity, as permanent and mysterious as the limestone caves where their story began. And in a world that often seems short on heroes, perhaps that's exactly as it should be. This story ends, but many await. Subscribe so no tale escapes you.